The house had grown quiet, almost unnervingly so, as I stood in the kitchen staring at the clock on the stove. The fluorescent green numbers flashed 7:15 p.m. Mark was supposed to be home by 6, but then again, what did supposed to be home by 6? But then again, what did supposed to be home by 6? Lately, he was always late. Work was his priority, the thing that consumed every moment of his day. I sighed and stirred the pot of spaghetti sauce simmering on the stove, the rich aroma filling the air, but failing to lift my mood. This was how it always went, me preparing dinner alone, waiting for a man who seemed more like a distant roommate than my husband of 15 years. I glanced at my reflection in the kitchen window, the dim light highlighting lines on my face I swore weren't there last year. My hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and I wore an oversized sweater that swallowed any trace of the woman I used to be. I wasn't sure when the shift had happened between us. Maybe it was gradual, creeping in like a slow tide, until I woke up one day and realized we were miles apart. Mark used to make me laugh, really laugh. We'd share wine on the couch and talk about everything and nothing until the early hours. Now, the silence between us was almost deafening. "Hey, Carol," a voice said behind me, breaking my train of thought. I turned to see Liam leaning against the kitchen doorframe. His damp hair clung to his forehead, and a towel hung casually over his bare shoulders. He had clearly just stepped out of the shower, and his athletic build made me momentarily forget how to respond. "Dinner smells good," he added, flashing a crooked smile. He had a way of smiling that felt warm, disarming, even when I didn't want to be charmed. "Thanks," I said, finally finding my voice. I busied myself with the sauce, suddenly hyper-aware of his presence. Liam had moved back home a few months ago after finishing college. It was supposed to be temporary, just a stop on his way to finding his footing. But in those 3 months, his presence had stirred up something I couldn't quite name. Liam walked into the kitchen, his movements casual but deliberate. He opened the fridge and grabbed a bottle of water, then leaned against the counter. "Where's Mark?" "Working late," I replied, my tone clipped. "He's always working late." I didn't respond, focusing instead on stirring the sauce. The truth was too bitter to admit out loud. Mark was always working late because it was easier than being here, easier than facing me. "You okay?" Liam asked, his voice softer now. He tilted his head, studying me in a way that made me feel both seen and vulnerable. "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly. The last thing I needed was to unload my marital woes on my stepson. But his gaze lingered, and for a moment, I wondered if he could see through my facade. Dinner was a quiet affair. Liam sat across from me at the small kitchen table, his chair slightly tilted back as he twirled spaghetti around his fork. He filled the silence with stories about his college days, his friends, the professors he hated, the wild parties he half-joked he'd attended. I found myself laughing at his animated expressions, the way he gestured with his hands as he talked. It felt nice to have company, even if it wasn't the company I had once imagined for myself. "You should have seen this one professor," he said, grinning. "He wore the same mustard yellow sweater every day, like he didn't know any other colors existed." I laughed, shaking my head. Maybe it was a lucky sweater. Lucky for him, maybe, not for us. I failed his class twice. "Twice!" I exclaimed, and we both laughed, the sound filling the kitchen in a way I hadn't realized I missed. As we cleared the table, Liam brushed past me, his arm grazing mine. It was such a small, innocent moment, but it sent a jolt through me. I chastised myself silently. This was Liam, Mark's son. There was nothing there. Nothing could be there. Later that night, the house grew still again. Mark had finally called to say he wouldn't be home until midnight. I hadn't even bothered to ask why. I found myself wandering the upstairs hallway, straightening picture frames and picking up stray socks Liam had left behind. When I reached his room, I paused. The door was cracked open, and I could hear his steady breathing as he slept. I leaned against the wall, intending only to linger for a moment before heading to bed. But then, faintly, I heard it. My name. Carol. It wasn't loud, more like a murmur, but it was unmistakable. He said it again, softer this time, almost like a sigh. My heart pounded, my mind racing. Was he dreaming? Or had he somehow known I was standing there? Shaking my head, I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. I leaned against it, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But no matter how hard I tried to push the moment aside, the sound of his voice lingered, wrapping around me like a whisper I couldn't escape. I crawled into bed and stared at the ceiling. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Mark. Won't be home tonight. Don't wait up. I turned the phone over without replying, the screen casting a pale glow across the room before it went dark. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, replaying the day's events in my mind. Liam's smile, his laugh, the way he said my name. It was all innocent, I told myself, just a harmless coincidence. But deep down, I knew there was something stirring, something I wasn't ready to name, and it terrified me. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds as I stood in front of my mirror, holding a black cocktail dress against my body. It had been buried in the back of my closet, a relic of a time when I felt desirable, vibrant, alive. I hadn't worn it in years, and I wasn't even sure why I had pulled it out now. Maybe it was a quiet act of defiance against the monotony of my days. Or maybe I just needed to remember what it felt like to be seen. The fabric still felt smooth and luxurious as I slipped it on, the zipper gliding up my back with a satisfying hum. I turned to examine myself in the mirror, smoothing the dress over my hips. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of the woman I used to be, before time and life had dulled her edges. I ran my fingers through my hair, fluffing it out, and allowed myself a small smile. Maybe I wasn't as far gone as I thought. A sudden knock at the door startled me. Before I could respond, it swung open. "Hey, I was wondering." Liam's voice trailed off as he froze in the doorway. His eyes widened, and for a heartbeat, neither of us moved. "Liam," I gasped, grabbing a nearby sweater and clutching it to my chest. "What are you doing? Don't you knock." His face turned an impressive shade of red as he stammered, I didn't know you were, I'm sorry. I was just looking for, he gestured vaguely, his eyes darting anywhere but at me. I'll go." He backed out of the room, pulling the door closed with a loud click. Oh, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I pressed my back against the dresser, staring at the door as if it might swing open again. What had just happened? I couldn't shake the image of his face, how his gaze had lingered for just a second too long before he looked away, and I couldn't ignore the way my own body had reacted, a rush of adrenaline and something deeper, more dangerous. For the rest of the day, I avoided Liam. I stayed in my room, only venturing out when I was certain he wasn't nearby. It was ridiculous, I told myself. I was the adult here, the one who should set boundaries. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his expression again: shock, embarrassment, and something else I couldn't quite name. That evening, I found a note slipped under my door. The handwriting was neat, almost meticulous. "I'm sorry for earlier. You looked, beautiful." I stared at the words for a long time, my emotions a confusing swirl of flattery, guilt, and something I couldn't admit even to myself. My hands trembled as I folded the note and tucked it into my dresser drawer, as though hiding it away would make the moment disappear. The next few days were an exercise in awkwardness. Liam seemed to be everywhere, offering to help with chores, lingering in the kitchen while I cooked, or sitting just close enough during family dinners to make my skin prickle with awareness. I convinced myself it was all in my head, a product of my overactive imagination. But then there were the moments I couldn't explain. The way his hand would brush mine when passing a plate, or how his gaze would linger on me a second too long before he quickly looked away. One afternoon, I was struggling with the new coffee maker in the kitchen. The instruction manual was a maze of diagrams and tiny print, and I was on the verge of giving up when Liam appeared at my side. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice casual but tinged with amusement. "I think this thing hates me," I muttered, holding up a mess of buttons and parts. "I've been at it for 20 minutes, and it still won't brew." "Here, let me," he said, reaching for the machine. His hand brushed mine as he took it, and I felt a jolt that was almost electric. I pulled back quickly, pretending to busy myself with wiping the counter. He worked quietly, his brow furrowed in concentration. Within minutes, the machine sputtered to life, the rich aroma of coffee filling the air. "There you go," he said, flashing me that easy smile of his. "Not so bad, right?" "Thanks," I said, avoiding his gaze. My cheeks felt warm, and I hated how transparent I must have looked. But Liam didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. That night, a storm rolled in. The rain lashed against the windows, and the power flickered out just after dinner. I lit a few candles, their warm glow casting shadows across the walls. Liam joined me in the living room, bringing a stack of books and a flashlight. "It's kind of nice, isn't it?" he said, sitting down on the couch beside me. "No screens, no distractions, just this." I nodded, hugging my knees to my chest. The air felt thick with something unspoken, the kind of silence that wasn't really silence at all. As we sifted through the books, our hands reached for the same one. His fingers brushed mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The room seemed to shrink around us, the only sound the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. "Sorry," I whispered, pulling my hand away. "It's okay," he said, softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. When I finally retreated to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. It wasn't just the touch, or the way his eyes had met mine in the candlelight. It was the way my heart had raced. The way I couldn't stop thinking about him long after the storm had passed. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I told myself it was nothing, just a series of coincidences, a product of the tension in the house. But deep down, I knew better. Something was happening, and I didn't know how to stop it. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds as I sipped my coffee, pretending to read the newspaper. Liam was in the kitchen with me, moving around with a quiet confidence that I was beginning to notice more and more. He had a way of filling the space, his presence both comforting and disarming. "Want some eggs?" he asked, holding up a frying pan with a grin. I glanced up and shook my head. No thanks. Um, I'm good with just coffee. You can't survive on coffee, Carol, he teased, his tone light. You'll waste away. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. I'll manage. Moments like these had become more frequent, easy, casual interactions that carried an undertone of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. There was a charge in the air whenever Liam was near, an awareness that neither of us acknowledged but both seemed to feel. The weekend arrived, with Mark heading out of town for another business trip. The house felt quieter, but not lonely. Liam and I fell into an easy rhythm, sharing meals and conversations that felt more meaningful than the ones I had with my husband. One evening, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, Liam stretched his arm along the back of the couch. The movement was casual, but it brought him closer to me than usual. I felt the warmth of his arm just inches from my shoulder, and my heartbeat quickened. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, as if sensing my discomfort. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary before turning back to the screen. I pretended to focus on the movie, but all I could think about was the tension simmering between us. It was unspoken but undeniable, like a string pulled taut, ready to snap. The following day, a light drizzle kept us indoors. I busied myself with cleaning, wiping down the kitchen counters and sweeping the floors. Liam appeared out of nowhere, leaning against the doorframe with a cup of coffee in hand. "You don't have to do all that," he said, watching me with an amused expression. "It's just the two of us." "Someone has to," I replied, keeping my focus on the task at hand. But his presence was distracting, his gaze heavy as it followed my movements. "Can I help?" he asked, setting his coffee down and stepping closer. "No, I've got it," I said quickly, but he didn't listen. He picked up the dustpan and crouched beside me as I swept the pile of dirt into it. His shoulder brushed mine, and I froze, the proximity sending a jolt through me. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't move right away, his gaze meeting mine. "You're welcome," he replied, his tones soft but charged with something I couldn't ignore. And that night, as the rain picked up outside, the power flickered and went out again. I sighed, reaching for the matches to light the candles I kept in the drawer. Liam appeared behind me, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "Storm's back," he said. "Seems like it," I replied, lighting a candle and setting it on the counter. The soft glow filled the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Want some company?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of something unspoken. I hesitated but then nodded, "Sure." We ended up in the living room again, the candlelight casting a warm, intimate glow. Liam sat closer to me than usual, the space between us shrinking with every passing moment. I could feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the waxy smell of the candles. "Do you ever wonder," he began, then stopped, as if unsure whether to continue. "Wonder what?" I asked, turning to face him. "Never mind," he said quickly, shaking his head. But his gaze lingered on me, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't name. The silence between us stretched, heavy and charged. My pulse quickened as his hand brushed mine, so lightly I could have convinced myself it was an accident, if not for the way his eyes held mine. I pulled my hand back, my cheeks flushing. "I think I'm going to call it a night," I said, standing abruptly. He didn't stop me, but I felt his gaze on my back as I left the room. The next morning, the tension between us was palpable. I avoided being alone with Liam, keeping myself busy with chores and errands, but he seemed to find reasons to cross my path, offering to help with groceries, asking me to join him for lunch, or simply sitting in the kitchen while I worked. "Are you okay?" he asked at one point, his tone laced with genuine concern. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Why wouldn't I be?" He didn't push, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, I felt them approach before I heard him. His presence was magnetic, pulling me toward him, even as I fought to keep my distance. "Carol," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "About what?" "About us," he said, his gaze steady and unflinching. "There is no us," I replied, my voice shaking. "You're my stepson." His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "I know what I feel," he said simply, "and I think you feel it too." I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came. The air between us was thick with unspoken truths, and for a moment I thought he might step closer, might say something that would shatter the fragile boundary we'd been skirting. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of guilt, longing, and fear. The next day began like any other. I woke up early, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the night before. Liam had left the house, likely going to the gym or running errands, and I felt a sense of relief at having the space to clear my head. The silence was a welcome reprieve from the storm of emotions that had been brewing inside me. But the calm didn't last. Around noon, I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard the front door open. I glanced up to see Liam standing there, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. His hair was damp from the rain outside, and his cheeks were flushed, as if he'd been running. "Where did those come from?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempt at casualness. "The field near the park," he said, stepping closer. "I thought they'd brighten up the house." I forced a smile, but my heart was pounding. "That's thoughtful of you, thank you." He placed the flowers on the coffee table, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. "Can we talk now? Properly?" I set the laundry aside, knowing I couldn't avoid this any longer. "Liam, this isn't appropriate." "Why not?" he interrupted, his tone firm but not angry. "I know you feel it too, Carol. I see it in the way you look at me." "That's enough," I said sharply, standing to put some distance between us. "This is wrong. You're my stepson. This can't happen." "But I'm not a child," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'm an adult, and I know what I want." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, but the sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway froze us both. Liam glanced toward the window, then back at me, his expression a mixture of frustration and longing. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low, before turning and walking upstairs. I barely had time to compose myself before Mark walked in, carrying his laptop bag and wearing the same distracted expression he always did. "Hey," he said, barely glancing at me as he headed for his office. "Long day. Don't wait up for me tonight. I've got a lot of work to do." And just like that, he disappeared, leaving me standing alone in the living room, Uh, the wildflowers on the coffee table, a silent reminder of the tension that had just unfolded. That evening, the storm returned, mirroring the chaos in my mind. The rain lashed against the windows as I sat in the dimly lit kitchen, nursing a glass of wine. My thoughts were a whirlwind of guilt and confusion, circling back to Liam's words over and over again. You feel it too. Did I? I hated how easily his voice replayed in my head, how the memory of his gaze made my pulse quicken. This wasn't who I was, or at least it wasn't who I thought I was. But the lines between right and wrong were beginning to blur, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to redraw them. The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. Liam stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. "We need to finish this conversation," he said, his voice steady but insistent. "There's nothing to finish," I replied, though my voice lacked conviction. "This has to stop." "Wait," he asked, stepping closer, "because it's easier to pretend you don't feel the same way?" "Liam, this isn't about feelings," I said, my tone pleading. "This is about what's right, and this, whatever this is, can't happen." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might argue. Instead, he closed the remaining distance between us, his presence overwhelming. "Just tell me one thing," he said quietly. "If Mark wasn't in the picture, would you feel differently?" His question hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to say no, to deny everything, but the words caught in my throat. My silence was answer enough. Liam reached out, his hand brushing mine. The touch was so light, so tentative, but it sent a wave of warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. I should have pulled away, should have ended this right then and there. But instead, I froze, caught in the pull of something I couldn't name. He leaned in, his breath warm against my cheek. "I don't want to make your life harder," he said softly. "But I can't pretend I don't feel this." Before I could respond, his lips brushed mine. It was the barest of touches, hesitant and fleeting, but it set my entire body alight. I pulled back abruptly, my heart pounding. "This isn't right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," he replied, his tone filled with both regret and defiance, "but it doesn't change how I feel." Without another word, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my thoughts spinning out of control. The rain continued to pound against the windows, a relentless rhythm that matched the chaos inside me. The following days were a blur of avoidance. I threw myself into errands, chores, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of that kiss or the way it had made me feel. Liam seemed to sense my need for space, keeping his distance, but never far enough that I could truly forget. His presence lingered in the background, a constant reminder of the boundary we'd crossed. One afternoon, Mark came home early. Catching me off guard, he found me in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone more observant than concerned. "And just busy," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than usual before he turned his attention to his phone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, relieved that he didn't press further. But later that night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't ignore the growing weight of my guilt. Mark's obliviousness only made it worse, highlighting just how far I'd strayed from the person I thought I was. And yet, as much as I wanted to push Liam away, I couldn't deny the pull he had on me. It was dangerous and wrong, but it was real, and I had no idea what to do about it. The house was unusually quiet the next morning. Mark had left for work early, his presence reduced to the faint scent of his aftershave lingering in the hallway. Liam was nowhere to be seen, and for once, I welcomed the solitude. I needed time to think, to sort through the tangled messes of emotions that had taken root inside me. But the silence didn't last. Around noon, I found Liam in the backyard, sitting on the edge of the porch with a sketch pad balanced on his knees. The sight surprised me. I hadn't seen him draw since his college days, when art was his escape from the pressures of growing up. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his pencil moving across the page with fluid precision. "What are you working on?" I asked, stepping closer. He glanced up, startled, then quickly closed the sketch pad. "Just messing around," he said, his tone guarded. I hesitated, unsure whether to press him or leave him alone. But before I could decide, he stood and slipped the sketch pad under his arm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. I crossed my arms, bracing myself. "Liam, I thought we agreed." "No, you decided," he interrupted, his eyes flashing with frustration. "But this isn't just about you, Carol. I'm part of this too." I opened my mouth to respond, but he cut me off, stepping closer. "You keep pushing me away, pretending like none of this matters. But I know it does. I can see it every time you look at me." "That doesn't make it right," I said, my voice shaking. "This, whatever this is, it's wrong, Liam. It's selfish and reckless, and it's not fair to Mark." "Fair to Mark?" he repeated, his tone incredulous. "Do you even hear yourself? He's barely here, Carol. He's checked out of this marriage, and you know it." His words hit a nerve, but I refused to let him see how deeply they cut. "That doesn't justify." "It doesn't have to," he said, his voice softening. "I'm not asking you to justify anything. I'm asking you to be honest with yourself. What do you want?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I couldn't look at him, couldn't let him see the truth in my eyes, because the truth terrified me. "I can't do this," I whispered, turning away. "I won't." That evening, Mark came home early, a rare occurrence that left me feeling more unsettled than relieved. He found me in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, and leaned against the counter with an air of casual curiosity. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone neutral but probing. "Just busy," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." "Do I?" he asked, raising an eyebrow, "because it feels like I don't know much about what's going on with you these days." His words caught me off guard, and I froze mid-chop. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're different," he said, his gaze steady, distracted, distant. I swallowed hard, my mind racing for a response. "Maybe it's because you're never here," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He frowned, his expression shifting from curiosity to defensiveness. That's not fair, Carol. You know how demanding my job is. And you know how lonely it is being married to someone who's never around," I shot back, my voice rising. The argument escalated quickly, each of us lashing out with words we couldn't take back. By the time Mark stormed out of the kitchen, I was left feeling drained and hollow, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me like a stone. Later that night, Liam knocked on my bedroom door. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "To talk," he said simply. "Please." I stepped aside, letting him in. He stood awkwardly by the door, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I'm leaving," he said finally. "I think it's for the best." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Leaving? Where?" "Back to school, maybe," he said, his tone uncertain. "Or somewhere else. I can't stay here, not like this." I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't have to go, but I knew he was right. His presence was a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed, the feelings I couldn't ignore. Wow, I asked, my throat tight. "Tomorrow," he said. "I've already packed." I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. The room felt too small, too suffocating, and I needed him to leave before I said something I'd regret. "Good night, Carol," he said, his voice soft. And then he was gone. The next morning, I stood by the window, watching as Liam loaded his car. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge me, and I didn't blame him. When he finally drove away, the emptiness in the house was deafening. Mark was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed. I turned away from the window, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had lost and what I had almost destroyed. The days after Liam's departure felt like walking through a hollowed-out version of my life. The house was quieter, emptier. Mark barely noticed the shift. His attention remained consumed by work, the occasional grunt of acknowledgement his only contribution to our shared space. But for me, every corner of the house seemed to echo with Liam's absence. I tried to fill the void with routines, cleaning, errands, baking recipes I hadn't touched in years, anything to distract myself from the weight in my chest. But no matter how much I tried to lose myself in the ordinary, my thoughts always circled back to him. The wild flowers he had picked still sat on the coffee table, their petals beginning to wilt. I hadn't been able to bring myself to throw them away. A week later, Mark finally seemed to notice my distance. We were sitting at the dinner table, the clinking of silverware the only sound between us. Out of nowhere, he set his fork down and looked at me. "Are we okay?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I stared at him, trying to decipher the sincerity behind it. Did he really care, or was this just an obligation? Something he felt he should ask because it had been too long since we'd spoken about anything meaningful? "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible. His brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't feel like we're connected anymore," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of my words. "I feel alone, Mark, like I've been alone for a long time." He sat back, his expression shifting from confusion to defensiveness. "I've been working hard for us, Carol, for our future." "What future?" I asked, the frustration spilling out of me. "You're always at work, and when you're here, you're not really here. We don't talk. We don't share anything anymore. Do you even care about this marriage?" His silence spoke volumes. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know you felt this way." "Well, now you do," I said, the weight of my confession leaving me feeling both liberated and exhausted. The rest of the meal passed in strained silence. When Mark finally retreated to his office, I sat alone at the table, staring at the remnants of our dinner. I didn't feel hopeful or relieved, just tired. The conversation hadn't fixed anything, and deep down, I wasn't sure it could. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself wandering the house, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I ended up in Liam's room, standing in the doorway and taking in the emptiness. The bed was neatly made. The desk clear except for a single book he had left behind. I crossed the room and picked it up, the weight of it unfamiliar in my hands. As I flipped through the pages, something fell out. A pressed flower, its petals fragile and delicate, landed softly on the bedspread. My breath caught as I stared at it, memories rushing back. The way he had looked at me, the things he had said, the kiss we'd shared. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the book and the flower. For the first time since he left, I let myself cry. The tears came fast and hot, spilling over as I tried to reconcile the conflicting emotions inside me. Guilt, longing, regret. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Mark and I tried to rebuild our connection, though the effort felt half-hearted at best. He bought flowers one evening, roses, the kind I used to love, but they sat in a vase on the counter, untouched. We went out to dinner once, an awkward attempt at rekindling something, but the conversation was stilted, and we ended up eating in silence. I didn't tell him about Liam. Some truths were too heavy, too dangerous to share. Instead, I carried the weight of it alone, burying it deep where it couldn't surface and disrupt what little stability we had left. One afternoon, months later, I was in the backyard pruning the rose bushes when my phone buzzed with a text. I wiped my hands on my jeans and picked it up, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the name. Liam. The message was simple. "Hi, Carol. I hope you're doing okay." I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the past stay in the past, but another part, the part that still thought about him late at night, that still kept the pressed flower tucked in my dresser drawer, couldn't resist. "Hi, Liam. I'm okay. How are you?" The response came quickly. I'm good. I just wanted to check in, make sure you're all right." I smiled faintly, my heart aching in a way that was both painful and sweet. "Thank you. I'm glad you're doing well." For a moment, I considered saying more, telling him I missed him, asking if he ever thought about me. But I stopped myself. Some things were better left unsaid. The story ends with Carol standing in her garden, the sun setting behind her. She looks at the phone in her hand, the text thread with Liam still open. A soft breeze rustles the leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of roses. She tucks the phone into her pocket and gazes out at the horizon, a mixture of hope and sadness in her eyes. Life goes on, but some moments, some connections leave marks that never truly fade. And maybe that's okay.